What if I told you that the most secret, shameful parts of your desire are not a flaw, but a map? That the powerful, sometimes overwhelming, force of lust isn't something to be conquered or suppressed, but a coded message from the deepest, wisest part of yourself? In our modern world, we're taught to sanitize desire. We label it, categorize it, and often we feel a deep sense of erotic shame when our own urges don't fit neatly into the boxes society has built. This internal conflict, this war against our own nature, can lead to a profound sense of disconnection, a state of emotional numbness where life loses its color and vitality. This is often the result of sexual repression trauma, whether from our upbringing, our culture, or our own harsh inner critic. We push these powerful energies down, deep into the unconscious, into what the pioneering psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow. But the shadow is not a monster to be slain. It is the container of our lost potential, our raw power, and our unlived life. And at the core of this shadow self, lust often burns the brightest. This isn't just a biological impulse. From a Jungian perspective, Carl Jung's sexuality refers to libido as a fundamental psychic energy, a life force that fuels not just procreation, but creativity, ambition, and spiritual seeking. So why do you feel that magnetic, almost fated pull towards a certain person? That is the world of unconscious attraction, often guided by the powerful Jung sexual archetypes within you. For a man, this is frequently the projection of his anima, his inner feminine soul image, onto the outer world. The intensity of his lust is often the intensity of his soul's cry for wholeness. Your most private daydreams, the ones that exist in the charged space between shame and fantasy, are not random noise. They are symbolic communications from your unconscious, pointing toward what you need for self-integration to truly begin this journey. We have to start by dismantling our most basic assumption about lust itself. When you hear that word lust, what immediately comes to mind? For most of us, the associations are purely biological, almost mechanical. It's a primal urge, a chemical cocktail in the brain, a reproductive instinct dressed up in modern clothes. It's the body wanting what it wants, separate from, and often at odds with, the higher functions of our mind and spirit. This perspective is deeply ingrained in our culture, and it owes a great deal to the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. For Freud, the driving force of human life was the libido, which he primarily defined as the energy of our sexual instincts. This energy, arising from a part of the psyche he called the ID, is a cauldron of raw instinctual drives seeking pleasure and release. In the Freudian model, civilization, morality, and personal development were all locked in a constant, strenuous battle to manage and sublimate this powerful, unruly sexual force. Lust, in this view, is the raw, unfiltered voice of the ID, a biological imperative that we must either satisfy, repress, or cleverly redirect. And while this model was revolutionary, it contains undeniable truths about our instinctual nature. It also leaves us with a profound problem. If lust is just a base, biological urge, then our only real options are to become a slave to it, or to become its jailer. We either indulge it and risk chaos, or we suppress it and risk becoming rigid, joyless, and disconnected from our own vitality. It paints a picture of a house divided against itself, our animal nature versus our civilized self. But what if this picture is incomplete? What if it's a map of a single country, when we need a map of the entire world? This is where Carl Jung, once Freud's chosen heir, dramatically parted ways with his mentor. Jung looked at the sheer force of human desire, the artist's obsessive drive to create, the mystic's passionate yearning for the divine, the entrepreneur's relentless ambition to build on. He saw that the energy fueling them all felt remarkably similar. It was a fire, a driving force, a deep and powerful current. He proposed that Freud's definition of libido was far too narrow. For Jung, libido is not just sexual energy. It is psychic energy. It is the total, undifferentiated life force that animates us. Imagine a massive, powerful river flowing from a single, vast source. That river is your libido, your fundamental will to live. As this river flows through the landscape of your life, it can branch off into many different channels. One channel might become a powerful waterfall. Crashing with immense force, this is the intense, focused energy of lust and romantic passion. Another channel might flow into a complex irrigation system, nurturing the fields of your career and family life. A third might be diverted to a massive hydroelectric dam, its power harnessed to generate the light of creative insight and artistic expression. A fourth might flow into a deep, quiet lake of spiritual contemplation. The energy is the same, only its expression changes. This is the foundational principle of what we can call Carl Jung's sexuality. It's a holistic view. Your sexual energy is not separate from your creative energy, your spiritual energy, or your ambitious energy. It is all one and the same life force, manifesting in different ways depending on your psychological needs and your level of conscious awareness. Lust, in this expansive Jungian view, is not a lower or baser instinct to be overcome. It is simply one of the most potent, raw, and concentrated expressions of your fundamental life force. It's the river at its most thunderous and powerful, demanding your attention. So why does this distinction matter so much? Because it changes everything about how we relate to our deepest urges. If lust is merely a biological problem, our only question is, what do I do about this feeling? But if lust is a potent expression of your total psychic energy, the question becomes, what is this feeling trying to tell me? It shifts us from a manager of impulses to a decoder of symbols. The intensity and direction of your lust become vital pieces of information about the state of your entire psyche. It's no longer a glitch in the system. It's a diagnostic reading. It means that an overwhelming, obsessive lust might not just be about the other person. It might be a sign that the other channels of your life force are blocked. Perhaps your creativity is stagnant, your spiritual life is dry, or your work feels meaningless. Your psyche, in its infinite wisdom, then funnels all of that dammed-up life energy into the one channel that remains open, the primal, undeniable channel of erotic desire. The desire feels so overwhelming because it is carrying the psychic weight of all your other unlived potentials. This reframing is the key that unlocks the rest of our journey today. When we see lust as a manifestation of our total being, we can begin to understand why it gets so entangled with our hidden self. It provides the energy and the heat for the great work of looking inward. So as we move forward, hold this image in your mind. You are not a battleground between an angel and an animal. You are a living system of energy. And the powerful, sometimes frightening current of lust is not the enemy. It is the river itself, reminding you of the immense power you hold within. The real question is, what happens when we become afraid of this power? What happens when we label this sacred, vital river as dirty and try to dam it up, deny its existence, and push it into the darkness of our unconscious? So, we've established this powerful, universal river of life force, our libido, that flows through each of us. But here we arrive at the most crucial question of our inner lives. What happens when we are taught to be ashamed of our own river? What happens when we decide that its most powerful currents, the thunderous waterfalls of lust and raw desire, are dangerous, dirty, or unacceptable? We don't stop the river. That's impossible. Instead, we perform a strange and tragic feat of psychological engineering. We build a dam, divert the flow, and pretend that part of the river doesn't exist. We push it underground, into the darkness. In Jungian psychology, this dark, subterranean landscape of our psyche has a name: the shadow. To understand the shadow, imagine you're packing for a long journey that represents your life. You have a single suitcase, and this suitcase is your conscious identity, what Jung called the persona. It's the mask you show the world. You pack all the traits you're proud of: kindness, intelligence, discipline, generosity. You pack everything your parents, teachers, and society told you was good and acceptable. But what about the other things? What about your anger, your envy, your aggression, your selfishness? What about the raw, untamed, animalistic desires that don't fit the nice guy or good girl image in your suitcase? You can't just leave them behind. They are part of you. So, you stuff them into a heavy, dark backpack that you sling over your shoulder. You spend your entire life pretending this backpack isn't there, even as its weight shapes your posture and slows your every step. That backpack is your shadow. It's the repository for every part of yourself that you have disowned. It is crucial to understand that the shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply that which is unconscious. It is the unlived and unloved part of you. And it is here, in this disowned darkness, that our lust often goes to hide. From a very young age, we receive messages. Don't be so aggressive. Nice people don't have thoughts like that. Your desires are sinful. Each judgment is another part of our natural vitality. Another part of our life force being stuffed into the shadow backpack. Our raw, powerful, and perfectly natural lust, the very engine of life, is one of the first and heaviest things to be exiled. But here is the secret of the shadow. What is repressed does not disappear. In fact, it does the opposite. When we refuse to look at something inside ourselves, we give it power. Down in the darkness of the unconscious, our disowned lust doesn't just sit quietly. It festers. It becomes distorted, more primitive, and more desperate for attention. It develops a life of its own, a kind of splinter personality. This is the shadow's hunger. It is hungry for light, hungry for acknowledgement, hungry for integration. And how does it get our attention? Through projection. Since we refuse to see this desire in ourselves, our psyche ingeniously makes us see it everywhere else. We project our own disowned shadow onto other people. That person you are inexplicably, magnetically, and almost painfully attracted to, the one who seems to embody a raw, unapologetic sexuality that both thrills and terrifies you, you are likely seeing your own exiled desire, your own shadow, walking around in the world. The intensity of your lust for them is often a direct measure of how deeply you have repressed that same quality in yourself. This is the foundation of shadow work desire. It is the courageous practice of turning around, taking off the heavy backpack, and finally looking inside. It's not about acting out every dark impulse. That is a dangerous misunderstanding. That's being possessed by the shadow. Shadow work is the opposite. It is the act of bringing conscious, compassionate awareness to these impulses. It's about asking the desire, what part of my own aliveness do you represent? Let's take a concrete example. Consider a man who has built his entire persona around being a calm, rational, and agreeable nice guy. He never raises his voice, avoids conflict, and prides himself on his control. Yet he is plagued by intense sexual fantasies of dominance and submission, where he finds himself irresistibly drawn to women who are fiery, wild, and unpredictable. His conscious mind is horrified. This isn't me, he thinks, filled with shame. But the Jungian perspective would say, this is exactly you. It is the part of you that you have exiled. His shadow contains all of his own disowned power, aggression, and healthy assertiveness. His psyche isn't literally telling him to become a tyrant. It's using the primal language of sexual fantasy, the language of the shadow, to send a desperate message. You need to integrate your power. You have disowned your own strength for so long that you have become incomplete. You must reclaim it to be whole. His hunger for the wild woman is his soul's hunger for its own lost wildness. By doing the shadow work, by journaling about these fantasies, by exploring his relationship with his own anger and power in a safe context, he can begin to integrate this energy consciously. He can learn to be assertive at work, to set boundaries in his relationships, to stand up for himself. As he does this, he becomes a more complete man. He is no longer just a nice guy, but a good man, one who has access to his own power and wields it with consciousness and integrity. And often, as this integration happens, the obsessive, compulsive nature of the original fantasy begins to fade. Its job is done. The message has been received. This is the immense promise hidden within our deepest, darkest urges. They are not a curse. They are a calling. They are the voice of your unlived life, begging to be brought into the world. But ignoring this call, leaving these powerful energies to fester in the dark, comes at a terrible price. It leads to a life of quiet desperation, of shame, and a creeping, lifeless numbness. And it is this price of repression that we must examine next. We've peered into the dark backpack of the shadow and seen where our most vital energies are exiled. We've acknowledged that this disowned part of us doesn't simply vanish. It lives, it hungers, and it projects itself out into the world, desperately seeking our attention. So, the question we must now face is a heavy one. What is the real, tangible cost of this self-exile? What is the price we pay day in and day out? For pretending we are not who we are, for keeping our own life force locked in a cage? This isn't just a philosophical problem. The cost is a deep psychological wound, a state of being that can be broken down into three interconnected stages of suffering: trauma, shame, and finally, a devastating numbness. Let's first talk about sexual repression trauma. When we hear the word trauma, we often think of a single catastrophic event. But trauma can also be a slow, chronic process. It can be the trauma of 1,000 tiny betrayals against the self. Every time you have a natural, spontaneous surge of desire and you flinch, judging it as wrong or dirty, you inflict a micro-trauma on your own psyche. Every time you push that energy down, you are telling the deepest part of yourself, you are not welcome here. You are not safe to exist. Imagine your psyche as a high-pressure boiler. And your libido, your life, forces the steam that gives it power. Repression is the act of clamping the lid on and refusing to let any of that steam out. Sexual repression trauma is the constant, exhausting, relentless effort of holding that lid down against an immense and natural pressure. It's the stress fractures that begin to form in the metal of the boiler itself. It's the constant, low-grade anxiety humming in the background of your life that's the sound of the pressure building. It's the sudden, inexplicable outbursts of anger or fits of melancholy that's the steam forcing its way out through the cracks. It is the deep psychic exhaustion that comes from spending the majority of your energy not on living, but on policing yourself. You are at war with your own nature, and that is a battle you can never truly win. Only endlessly fight at a terrible cost to your own peace, from this state of constant internal conflict. A toxic emotion is born, erotic shame. And we must be very clear about the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is the feeling that you've done something bad. It's a healthy emotion that can lead to amends and better behavior. Shame, however, is the deep, corroding belief that you are something bad. It's not about your actions. It's about your very essence. Erotic shame is the whisper that tells you that you're natural. God-given desires make you fundamentally flawed, broken, or unworthy of love. It's the internal jailer that patrols the borders of your conscious mind, ensuring that no impulse from the shadow ever sees the light of day. This shame creates a vicious feedback loop. The act of repression makes you feel ashamed of your desires, and that shame then convinces you that the repression is necessary for you to be a good person. This shame is profoundly isolating. It makes you feel like you are the only one in the world who has these dark thoughts or feelings. You look at others, who all seem so normal and put together in their own social masks. You feel like a monster hiding in plain sight. This forces you to reinforce your persona, to make your mask thicker and more convincing, further widening the gap between the person you pretend to be and the totality of who you actually are. Shame is the true architect of the prison we build for ourselves. And what happens when a prisoner has been locked in solitary confinement for too long? In a war they can never win, burdened by a shame they can no longer bear. The psyche, in an act of self-preservation, chooses the final, tragic defense: emotional numbness. Imagine your capacity to feel is a complex audio mixing board. There are sliders for every emotion: joy, passion, grief, anger, excitement, and yes, lust. When we are consumed by the trauma of repression and the pain of shame, we decide that the lust slider is causing too much noise, too much static, too much danger, so we try to force it all the way down to zero. But we cannot isolate one emotion so precisely. In our desperate attempt to silence the one thing we fear, our clumsy psychological hands inevitably pull down all the other sliders along with it. In killing our lust, we slowly kill our ability to feel anything deeply. This is emotional numbness. This is life lived in grayscale. It's when you achieve a goal you've worked years for, and you feel nothing. It's when you hug someone you love, but you feel a strange sense of distance, as if you're separated by a wall of glass. It's when food loses its taste, music loses its power to move you, and beauty becomes merely an intellectual concept rather than a felt experience. It is not peace. It is a wasteland. It is the absence of pain, yes, but it is also the absence of joy, passion, and meaning. It is the ultimate price of repression. You cut yourself off from the river of life force and are left stranded in a silent, colorless desert. This is the state that brings many people to therapy, to spiritual seeking, or to desperate, life-altering crises. They come not because they are in pain, but because they feel nothing at all. And the emptiness has become more terrifying than any pain could ever be. But even here, in the gray twilight of the numb soul, the life force does not give up. The river, though pushed underground, is still flowing, and it will find a way to get your attention. It will gather all of its remaining power and project it outward, creating a beacon so bright and so compelling you cannot possibly ignore it. It will place the image of your own lost soul, your own capacity to feel, onto another person, and you will call that feeling desire. This is the unconscious mind's last best effort to save you from the gray. This is the call of the anima, and that is our pathway out of the wasteland. We've walked through the desolate, grayscale landscape of the repressed psycho-world, drained of color and feeling by trauma and shame. It would be easy to believe that this is the end of the story, a psychological checkmate where numbness wins. But the human spirit is far more resilient than that. The river of life, though forced deep underground, never stops seeking the light. Even in the deepest numbness, the psyche has a secret, powerful, often dramatic strategy to call you back to life. It sends you a messenger. This messenger appears in the form of a sudden, startling, and often overwhelming attraction. Out of nowhere, a single person in a world of billions seems to light up, to glow with a special significance. You see them across a room, you hear their voice, you encounter their image, and suddenly, the gray world is flooded with color. This intense magnetic pull, what we so often call lust or infatuation, is not a random biological misfiring. From a Jungian perspective, it is a sacred summons. It is your soul attempting to rescue itself. To understand how this works, we first need to grasp one of Carl Jung's most profound ideas, the archetypes. Archetypes are universal, primordial patterns or blueprints that reside in what Jung called the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche, shared by all humanity. Think of them as the psychic software that comes pre-installed in every human being: the hero, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster. These aren't just characters and stories. They are living, dynamic structures within our own minds. And when it comes to the psychology of relationship, desire, and the soul, one of the most powerful and important of these Jungian sexual archetypes is the anima. Visuals of classical art depicting feminine figures, muses, goddesses, soul guides for a man, the anima is the archetypal feminine principle that lives within his own unconscious. She is the inner woman, the soul image. It's crucial to understand that this has nothing to do with being effeminate. The anima represents a man's capacity for all the things our culture is often incorrectly labeled as purely feminine. His intuition, his capacity for deep relatedness, his connection to his own emotions, his creativity, and his ability to experience life with meaning and soulfulness. The anima is his inner guide to the unconscious, his bridge to the deepest parts of himself. A man's relationship with his inner anima will profoundly dictate the quality of his relationships with outer women and with life itself. For women, the corresponding archetype is the animus, the inner masculine, which functions in a similar way. So, what happens to a man who, through cultural and personal conditioning, has repressed these qualities? What happens to the man who was taught that boys don't cry, that emotions are a weakness, and that intuition is illogical nonsense? He becomes disconnected from his own anima. He loses the connection to his own soul. And it is in this state of inner disconnection that the phenomenon of unconscious attraction takes place. because the anima, like any part of the shadow, will not be ignored. If a man cannot connect with this feminine energy within himself, his psyche will do something extraordinary. It will project it outward. He will unconsciously cast the image of his own soul onto an external person. This is the secret mechanism of that electrifying, almost magical sense of attraction. The person who suddenly fascinates you, who fills your daydreams, who ignites your deepest lust, they have become the screen for the projection of your own lost soul. You are not seeing them entirely as they are. You are seeing a reflection of the most beautiful, vital, and unlived part of yourself. The overwhelming desire you feel is the desperate cry of your own psyche saying, "There. That is the part of me that is missing. I must connect with it to be whole again." The intensity of your obsession is a direct measure of how disconnected you are from your own anima. A man who is deeply in touch with his own emotional life and creativity might feel a strong but manageable attraction. But a man living in the gray wasteland of emotional numbness, totally cut off from his soul, will experience this projection as a cataclysmic, life-altering event. He will feel that this other person is his salvation, the one and only key to his happiness. Jung even observed that the anima develops within a man in stages, and the nature of his attractions reveals his level of maturity. It might begin as Eve, a purely biological instinctual projection. Then it can develop into Helen of Troy, a beautiful but passive object of aesthetic and romantic desire. With more consciousness, it can mature into Mary, a figure of spiritual devotion. And finally to Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom, who acts as a true guide to the inner life. A man who is constantly chasing purely lustful, objectified attractions is often dealing with an undeveloped anima. Still in these early stages, herein lies both the immense danger and the profound opportunity of desire. The danger is to mistake the map for the territory. If you believe your salvation truly lies within this other person, you are heading for disaster. You will place impossible expectations on them, demanding that they be your muse, your goddess, your reason for living. When they inevitably reveal themselves to be a complex, flawed human being, the luminous projection will shatter, leading to bitterness, resentment, and a pattern of failed relationships. But the opportunity is life-changing. It is to recognize the projection for what it is, an invitation. The intense lust or infatuation is a sacred signpost, pointing you back toward yourself. Your psyche is using this other person to show you what you need to develop within. Are you obsessed with her wild, creative freedom? It's a call to cultivate your own creativity. Are you captivated by her deep, emotional intelligence? It's a sign that you must begin the journey into your own heart. The goal is not to possess the carrier of the projection, but to integrate the qualities within yourself that she represents. This is the great work. It is turning the hunger for another into the quest for your own wholeness. But to do that, we must first learn to read the specific language. The unconscious uses the symbolic, often shocking language of our private fantasies. And it is in that charged space between shame and fantasy where the next clue to our integration lies. Of course, here is the 1,000-word expansion for the section. Vi. The alchemy of desire, from fantasy to integration. The music becomes more intentional and focused, with undertones of mystery and transformation. The visuals evolve from figures and faces to ancient alchemical diagrams, showing vessels, fire, and the transmutation of lead into gold. Narrator, we have arrived at the heart of the great work. We understand that the overwhelming force of attraction is often a projection of our own soul, the anima, calling us back to ourselves. But this knowledge can feel abstract, even frustrating. It leaves us with a burning question. What do I actually do with this fire? This raw, overwhelming energy of lust is coursing through me. I can't ignore it, and I know now I shouldn't simply repress it. How do I work with it? The answer is that we must become alchemists. We must enter the private, secret laboratory of our own psyche, which is the realm of fantasy. For most people, this laboratory is a place of immense shame. The space between shame and fantasy is one of the most highly charged and fear-filled territories in our inner world. We believe our sexual fantasies are a direct reflection of our character. If they are dark, kinky, or taboo, we conclude that we ourselves are secretly depraved. This shame is the powerful lock on the laboratory door, preventing us from ever entering and discovering the secrets within. But from a Jungian and alchemical perspective, this shame is not just a barrier. It's a marker. It's a dragon guarding a treasure. The more shame a particular fantasy elicits, the more psychologically potent and important it is likely to be. The alchemist does not try to slay the dragon of shame, but rather to understand it, to see what precious material it is protecting. The first and most crucial step in this inner alchemy is to understand that the contents of our fantasies are almost never literal prescriptions for action. They are symbolic communications from the unconscious, much like dreams. They speak in a primal, metaphorical language. To engage in self-integration, we must learn to become translators of this symbolic language. A powerful rule of thumb is this: whatever role, quality, or person appears in your fantasy, it represents a part of you that is seeking conscious recognition. For example, a man who is a powerful CEO, always in command, might be disturbed to find he has recurring fantasies of submission. The literal interpretation, fueled by shame, is I'm weak or I'm broken. But the alchemical interpretation is that his psyche is crying out for balance. He has overdeveloped his assertive, controlling masculine side, and his unconscious is showing him the feminine qualities of surrender, receptivity, and letting go that he desperately needs to integrate to become a whole and ultimately more effective human being. His fantasy isn't about becoming powerless. It's about embracing a different kind of power. This is the alchemical process, taking the raw, chaotic, and often disturbing material of our fantasies, what the alchemists called the prima materia, or basely dan, consciously working with it until its hidden gold is revealed. But to perform alchemy, you need more than just raw material. You need a vessel, and you need fire. The alchemical vessel, the athanor, is your own conscious awareness, your body, your mind. It is your capacity to hold the tension of these powerful energies, without breaking, without acting them out compulsively on the one hand, or repressing them shamefully on the other. And this is where a practice like semen retention can be understood in a profound psychological and alchemical context, far beyond its physical implications. From this viewpoint, the conscious decision to retain this vital energy is the act of sealing the alchemical vessel. You are making a deliberate choice not to dissipate the prima materia. You are keeping this potent psychophysical energy inside the system so it can be worked. With this act has a powerful psychological effect. It forces a withdrawal of projections. When you don't immediately seek release, you can no longer simply blame your desire on the object of your fantasy. You cannot escape the energy by projecting it outward. You are forced to sit with the raw, uncomfortable truth that this immense power, these strange images, and this deep hunger are all arising from within you. This brings the energy back inside the vessel, where the real work can begin. With the vessel sealed and the raw material contained, we now need the fire. The alchemical fire is the sustained, courageous, and compassionate focus of your consciousness on the contents of your psyche. It is the heat generated by holding the emotional tension. It is sitting with the fantasy, not to indulge it for mere stimulation, but to question it. What are you? What quality do you represent? Why are you here now? You journal about it. You meditate on it. You bring the light of your awareness to the darkness. This conscious heat begins to cook the raw fantasy. It breaks down the rigid, literal images and separates the base elements. The shame begins to burn away. The compulsion begins to lessen. And through this process, the symbolic meaning, the pure gold, is slowly precipitated. The CEO who works with his submission fantasy finds the gold of receptivity. The person with a taboo fantasy about breaking rules finds the gold of authentic freedom from convention. This is true self-integration. It is not about adding something new to yourself, but about reclaiming the lost, exiled parts of who you already are. The gold that the alchemists sought was not the metal in their crucibles. It was a symbol for the integrated whole, an incorruptible self, what they sometimes called the philosopher's stone. It is the self that has made peace between its light and its shadow. This inner alchemy, this turning of our leaden shame into golden self-knowledge, is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice. It is the engine that drives the greatest journey a human being can undertake. And that journey has a name. Induit. We have journeyed through the labyrinth of the human psyche. We began with the raw, often shameful energy of lust. We followed it down into the subterranean depths of the shadow, witnessed its projection in the luminous face of the anima, and learned the secret art of alchemy, the transmutation of this base material into psychological gold through conscious awareness. And now, we arrive at the summit. We must ask the final and most important question: to what end? What is the purpose of all this difficult, sometimes painful inner work? The answer is the ultimate goal of Jung's entire psychological model, the very reason for the journey. It is what the alchemists called the magnum opus, or the great work. It is the path of individuation. Individuation psychology describes the natural, lifelong process of becoming a psychologically whole, distinct, and integrated individual. It is the journey of becoming the person you were always meant to be. Perhaps the most beautiful analogy for this is the acorn and the oak tree. Within every acorn lies the complete, unshakable blueprint for a mighty oak. The acorn's entire purpose, its driving impulse, is to realize this potential, to grow into the unique and magnificent tree it is destined to become. It must contend with the quality of the soil, the availability of water, the storms and the droughts. It cannot become a pine tree or a willow. Its destiny is to become the fullest expression of oakness. Visual of an acorn with a translucent, a glowing image of a full oak tree inside it. In the same way, each of us is born with a unique inner blueprint, a potential for wholeness that Jung called the self. The self is the totality of our being, encompassing both our conscious ego and our vast unconscious. The process of individuation is our life's work of consciously realizing and embodying this self, of becoming who we truly are, beyond the masks we wear and the roles we play. But here's the critical point that ties our entire exploration together. You cannot become a whole oak tree by cutting off your roots because you find them dark and messy, and you cannot achieve individuation by pursuing a fantasy of perfection, by trying to be only the light and good parts of yourself. Wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. A person who has successfully repressed their shadow is not individuated. They are amputated. They are a half-person, brittle and lacking in substance. This is why our lust, our desire, and our shadow are not obstacles on the path of individuation. They are the very gateway to it. That sudden life-disrupting eruption of lust, that obsessive attraction that shatters your carefully constructed life, is often the call to adventure for the individuation journey. It is the unconscious self, breaking through the rigid defenses of your conscious ego, your persona, forcing you to acknowledge that you are more than you think you are. It is a violent, beautiful, necessary summons to a larger life. Engaging with this energy is non-negotiable for anyone serious about the path. The alchemical work we described, facing our fantasies, withdrawing our projections, integrating our disowned qualities, is the core engine of individuation. The energy we reclaim from the shadow is the very energy we need to grow. The darkness of the shadow provides the rich, fertile soil from which the tree of the self can rise. So what does a person on the path of individuation look like? They are not perfect saints, floating above the mésanges of life. On the contrary, they are often more deeply and authentically engaged with it. The individuated person is one who is learning to hold the tension of their own inner opposites. They can be both strong and vulnerable, rational and intuitive, disciplined and spontaneous. They have begun to integrate their inner masculine and feminine principles, their anima or animus, so they no longer need to desperately seek their missing half in others. Their center of gravity has shifted from the outside world to the inside. They are less dependent on the praise or criticism of others for their sense of self-worth because they are. It's cultivating a direct relationship with their own inner core. The self And what of their relationship with lust? It has been transformed. It is no longer a source of deep shame or a compulsive, unconscious force that drives them into disastrous situations. Because they have faced it consciously, lust is no longer their master. Instead, its energy has been integrated into their total personality. It can now be experienced as a source of vitality, joy, creative passion, and conscious, authentic connection with another. It has been restored to its rightful place as a sacred expression of the life force. No longer exiled to the shadow, it is crucial to remember that individuation is not a destination you arrive at. You never achieve it once and for all. It is a continuous, lifelong process, a constant dialogue between your conscious ego and the vast, wise unconscious. It is the great work because it is the most meaningful and deeply rewarding work a human being can undertake. It is nothing less than the art of crafting a conscious whole and authentic soul. In the same way, each of us is born with a unique inner blueprint, a potential for wholeness that Jung called the self. The self is the totality of our being, encompassing both our conscious ego and our vast unconscious. The process of individuation is our life's work of consciously realizing and embodying this self, of becoming who we truly are, beyond the masks we wear and the roles we play. But here's the critical point that ties our entire exploration together. You cannot become a whole oak tree by cutting off your roots because you find them dark and messy. And you cannot achieve individuation by pursuing a fantasy of perfection, by trying to be only the light and good parts of yourself. Wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. A person who has successfully repressed their shadow is not individuated. They are amputated. They are a half-person, brittle and lacking in substance. This is why our lust, our desire, and our shadow are not obstacles on the path of individuation. They are the very gateway to it. That sudden, life-disrupting eruption of lust, that obsessive attraction that shatters your carefully constructed life, that is often the call to adventure for the individuation journey. It is the unconscious self, breaking through the rigid defenses of your conscious ego, your persona, forcing you to acknowledge that you are more than you think you are. It is a violent, beautiful, necessary summons to a larger life. Engaging with this energy is non-negotiable for anyone serious about the path. The alchemical work we described, facing our fantasies, withdrawing our projections, integrating our disowned qualities, is the core engine of individuation. The energy we reclaim from the shadow is the very energy we need to grow. The darkness of the shadow provides the rich, fertile soil from which the tree of the self can rise. So what does a person on the path of individuation look like? They are not perfect saints, floating above the messinzas of life. On the contrary, they are often more deeply and authentically engaged with it. The individuated person is one who is learning to hold the tension of their own inner opposites. They can be both strong and vulnerable, rational and intuitive, disciplined and spontaneous. They have begun to integrate their inner masculine and feminine principles, their anima or animus. So they no longer need to desperately seek their missing half in others. Their center of gravity has shifted from the outside world to the inside. They are less dependent on the praise or criticism of others for their sense of self-worth, because they are cultivating a direct relationship with their own inner core, the self. And what of their relationship with lust? It has been transformed. It is no longer a source of deep shame or a compulsive, unconscious force that drives them into disastrous situations. Because they have faced it consciously, lust is no longer their master. Instead, its energy has been integrated into their total personality. It can now be experienced as a source of vitality, joy, creative passion, and conscious, authentic connection with another. It has been restored to its rightful place as a sacred expression of the life force. No longer exiled to the shadow, it is crucial to remember that individuation is not a destination you arrive at. You never achieve it once and for all. It is a continuous, lifelong process, a constant dialogue between your conscious ego and the vast, wise unconscious. It is the great work because it is the most meaningful and deeply rewarding work a human being can undertake. It is nothing less than the art of crafting a conscious whole, an authentic soul.